In the early morning of the 1st of February 2003, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration's Mission Control Center is a hive of activity. The control room is located at the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Texas. The Mission Control Center is more commonly known by its call sign, so named because of the city it is located in, Houston. While the technology contained within the room has become more sophisticated over the years since the beginning of US spaceflight, the purpose of mission control has remained the same. Manage the flight of NASA's spacecraft after launch until landing. This morning, the mission controllers will be overseeing the deorbit, reentry, and landing of the Space Shuttle Orbiter, Columbia. Its latest mission, STS-107, marks the 28th time the shuttle has launched into orbit, having completed a variety of missions throughout its 22-year career. Columbia is the oldest operational orbiter. While the three other orbiters, Atlantis, Discovery, and Endeavour, have focused on the construction of the new International Space Station in recent years, Columbia has had a different purpose. The 7 astronauts aboard the orbiter have just completed a 16-day scientific mission. Working 24 hours a day in 2 alternating shifts, the crew have completed 80 experiments, with a particular focus on microgravity. You are listening to Inside the Black Box. These are the events of Shuttle Transportation System Mission 107.
Pull up! Pull up!
There are a number of key personnel in Houston Mission Control who will play a crucial role in what is about to happen. This group are collectively known as flight controllers. Leading Mission Control is Flight Director Leroy Kane, simply referred to in conversation as Flight. As the Flight Director, Kane has overall operational responsibility for missions and payload operations, and all the decisions made during the mission. Kane is also responsible for managing and coordinating the other flight controllers. Sitting beside Kane is the capsule communicator, Charles Hobaugh, who is himself an astronaut. Given it would be confusing for every member of Mission Control to contact the orbiter at once, all messages to the crew are relayed through the capsule communicator, or Capcom. Also present in Mission Control is Maintenance, Mechanical and Crew Systems Officer Jeff Kling, who in conversation will simply be referred to as Max. Kling will be responsible for monitoring the orbiter's structural and mechanical systems and communicating any issues to the flight director. Finally, the Integrated Communications Officer, or INCO, is responsible for all data, voice, and video communication systems. INCO monitors the telemetry link between the vehicle and the ground. There are a few other actors who we will discuss later. These and other mission controllers are sitting at consoles with an array of monitors displaying relevant data. At the front of the room are 3 enormous screens which provide a dashboard of critical mission information. In the center, a map tracks the live position updates of the shuttle as it orbits the Earth. Although the room is large, everybody present is able to speak to each other via headset intercom, which NASA calls a loop. Shortly after 8 a.m. local time, Flight Director Kane polls his flight controllers to confirm each of their respective responsibilities is go or no-go for re-entry. Each controller confirms that their respective systems are configured for the re-entry phase. With this poll successfully completed, at 8:10 a.m., capsule communicator Charles Hobaugh contacts Columbia, speaking to Rick Husband, who is the commander of STS-107.
Columbia, Houston.
Go ahead, Houston.
Yeah, Rick, I I guess you've been wondering, but you are go for the deorbit burn. We are going to continue to assess which runway end we prefer, but for now we are happy with the weather at KSC. You are go for the burn.
On the large screens at the front of Mission Control, Columbia's position on the global map shows it in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, close to the western coast of Australia, about 5,000 miles away from its landing site at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. A computer-simulated representation of Columbia in orbit shows the orbiter has been turned backwards, so its nose is facing opposite to the eastern direction of travel, flying upside down relative to the Earth. The orbiter will now fire its engines opposite to the direction it is travelling in order to slow itself down. Decreasing Columbia's speed will cause it to begin to fall from orbit until the point where she begins to experience the Earth's upper atmosphere. As Columbia continues to descend, it will use the friction caused by the Earth's atmosphere to slow to a safe speed. The shuttle will then glide through the Earth's atmosphere, touching down at Kennedy Space Center. At 8:15 a.m., Commander Rick Husband notifies Mission Control they have commenced the deorbit burn. The propulsion officer can see from his data that the engines are firing nominally. Over the next 2 minutes and 38 seconds, the engines thrust against Columbia's direction of travel. While the change in speed is relatively small, only about 1%, it is sufficient to start the shuttle falling back towards Earth. Columbia will be on the ground at the Kennedy Space Center in 1 hour from now. With the deorbit burn successfully completed, Mission Control advises the Columbia flight crew that they can begin other activities in preparation for re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. The first task is to position Columbia for re-entry. During the deorbit burn, Columbia was flying backwards and upside down. Now, she needs to pitch back towards the eastern direction of travel. The simulation on the large screen at the front of Mission Control shows Columbia beginning pitching its nose down towards the Earth. Over the next 15 minutes, the shuttle slowly pitches around until it is now facing the direction it is travelling in, with its nose pointed high relative to the Earth's atmosphere, at about 40 degrees. By exposing its belly to the Earth's atmosphere, the shuttle will generate the greatest level of drag possible, and most effectively decelerate. However, this positioning will also mean that these surfaces will be heated by the effects of atmospheric re-entry. To counter this heating, the shuttle uses its thermal protection system, a collective name for the various surfaces on the shuttle which are designed to withstand the intense heat caused by re-entry. The areas of the orbiter which will be exposed to the greatest level of heating, the belly, nose, and the bottom surface of the wings of the orbiter, are covered with either heat-resistant tiles or blankets in order to protect the shuttle's fragile aluminium structure. The leading edges of the wings are covered with reinforced carbon-carbon, or RCC panels. These panels are each uniquely shaped to match the contour of the shuttle's wings. The thermal protection system on the orbiter is so effective that one can touch the surface of one side of the tile when a blowtorch is being applied directly to the other side. The controllers at Houston see the crew of Columbia have also powered up the remaining 2 auxiliary power units, or APUs, bringing the total online to 3. Since the orbiter does not have conventional engines to power its systems, the APUs will deliver power to the orbiter's hydraulics in order to operate Columbia's flight control surfaces once it has entered Earth's atmosphere. At the initial stage of atmospheric re-entry, Columbia will still use the reaction control system it uses in orbit. The reaction control system is an array of thrusters which push the orbiter around during flight. But as the air becomes thicker, the control surfaces will become more effective. Eventually, only the control surfaces will be used to control Columbia's direction of travel. By 8:44 a.m., 29 minutes after the deorbit was commenced, Columbia has already descended 95 miles. On the large screens at the front of Mission Control, Columbia can be seen as being in the central Pacific Ocean, north of the Hawaiian Islands. At 80 miles above the Earth's surface, the mission controllers mark entry interface. This altitude is the point where the effects of Earth's atmosphere begin to be felt. The friction caused by the thin air will begin to decelerate the shuttle from its current speed of 17,000 miles per hour. As the air is compressed in the path of the shuttle, it begins to be heated, raising the temperature of Columbia's exposed surfaces. The controllers can monitor the temperature of the surfaces using the various sensors arrayed across the shuttle's body. Over the next 6 minutes, temperatures on the shuttle wings will reach a temperature of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1,350 degrees Celsius. During this period, Maintenance Mechanical and Crew Systems Officer Jeff Kling will be closely monitoring his instruments for anything out of the ordinary. 6 minutes after entry interface, at 8:50 a.m., the controllers can see Columbia begin the first of a number of automatically controlled high-speed banking maneuvers, known as S-turns. Because the shuttle has to maintain a fairly constant angle of attack of 40 degrees in order for its thermal protection system to be effective, the shuttle must use other methods to control its rate of descent. Columbia does this by turning, with a more steeper angle of bank causing the shuttle to descend more quickly, and a shallow bank causing the rate of descent to be lower. At about the same time as the turns are commenced, the orbiter enters a period of maximum heating. To the controllers on the ground, the re-entry appears to be proceeding exactly as planned. At 8:53 a.m., Columbia crosses the west coast of the continental United States, crossing slightly to the north of San Francisco, California. She has now decelerated to 15,800 miles per hour and descended to 45 miles above the Earth's surface, still on a right bank to control her rate of descent. At this point, Max Officer Jeff Kling sees the first signs of a problem. As Kling monitors his screens, he notices abnormal readings begin to appear. A sensor located on the left wing stops providing data. This is followed a few seconds later by another one. Over a period of 4 seconds, downward pointing arrows begin appearing next to readings for 4 temperature sensors located on the left wing. These sensors are designed to measure the temperature of the hydraulic fluid, which is used to power the aircraft's control surfaces. The arrows indicate that these sensors are now reading off-scale low. An off-scale low reading is one which falls below the measuring capability of the system. The MAX controller activates the loop to speak directly to Flight Director Leroy Kane to inform him of the situation.
Flight Max.
Go ahead, Max.
FYI, I've just lost 4 separate temperature transducers on the left side of the vehicle, hydraulic return temperatures. 2 of them on System 1 and 1 in each of Systems 2 and 3.
4 high return temps?
To the left outboard and left inboard elevons.
The flight director tries to work out whether the loss of the 4 sensors could be linked to a single point of failure.
Okay, is there anything common to them? DSC or MDM or anything? I mean, you're telling me you lost them all at exactly the same time.
No,
right?
not exactly. They were within probably 4 or 5 seconds of each other.
Okay. Where are those? Where is that instrumentation located?
All 4 of them are located in the aft part of the left wing, right in front of the elevon actuators. And there is no commonality.
No commonality.
Flight Director Kane considers the situation. The loss of the sensors is concerning. Without any commonality, the sensors would have had to have failed independently of each other. With damage to the hydraulic systems, the shuttle could have controllability issues once it's within the Earth's atmosphere. After confirming with Max again which systems the sensors related to, he speaks to his guidance, navigation and control officer. As the name suggests, GNC is responsible for monitoring the vehicle's guidance and navigation systems during the mission.
GNC flight.
Flight GNC.
Everything look good to you? Control and rates and everything is nominal, right?
Control's been stable through the rolls that we've done so far, Flight. We have good trims. I don't see anything out of the ordinary.
Okay. And Max flight?
Flight Max.
All other indications for your hydraulic system indications are good?
They're all good. We've got good quantities all the way across.
And the other temps are normal?
The other temps are normal, yes, sir.
And when you say you lost these, are you saying that they went
All four of them were off-scale low.
Or off-scale low?
And they were all staggered. They were, like I said, within several seconds of each other.
As Kane discusses the situation with his controllers, Columbia continues her journey. The large map at the front of Mission Control now shows Columbia crossing the New Mexico-Texas state line. Her speed has decelerated to 14,300 miles per hour, and her altitude is now 42 miles. She now begins the second half of her S-turn with a bank to the left. Over the radio, a broken call comes in on the air-to-ground loop from Columbia's commander, Rick Husband. A few seconds later, Max Officer Kling calls the flight director once again, with yet another problem.
Flight Max.
Go.
We just lost tire pressure on left outboard and left inboard, both tires.
Meanwhile, Capcom contacts Columbia to inform them they have seen the tire pressure readings fail.
And Columbia, Houston, we see your tire pressure messages and we did not copy your last.
Commander Husband begins to reply.
Roger,
At this point, 8:59 a.m. and 32 seconds, Houston loses real-time data from Columbia. However, this is not unexpected or out of the ordinary. The loss of signal coincides with the approximate time when the flight control team expect a short-duration loss of signal during an antenna switching. The onboard communication system will automatically reconfigure from the West Tracking and Data Relay System satellite to either the East satellite or the ground station at Kennedy Space Center. The Integrated Communications Officer, or INCO, Laura Hopp, contacts the flight director.
Flight INCO.
Go.
Yeah, we're just taking a few hits here. We're right up on top of the tail. Not too bad.
The comment about being on top of the tail refers to the shuttle's tail blocking the signal from the orbiter's radio antenna as it tries to communicate with the satellite behind it. Flight Director Kane returns to speaking with Max Officer Kling.
Max flight.
Flight Max.
And there's no commonality between all these tire pressure instrumentations and the hydraulic return instrumentations?
No, sir, there's not. We've also lost the nose gear down talkback and the right main gear down talkback.
Nose gear and right main gear down talkbacks?
Yes, sir.
The talkbacks are used to determine if hydraulic pressure is being delivered to deploy the landing gear. 30 seconds passes. On the large screen at the front of the room, Space Shuttle Columbia's position is frozen over Texas, where it had last sent data to Houston. The INCO officer once again contacts Flight Director Kane about the signal blackout.
Flight INCO, I didn't expect this bad of a hit on comm.
Kane considers alternative methods of contacting the orbiter. He knows that once the shuttle is close enough to Kennedy Space Center, they can use UHF radio communications instead of relying on the satellite communication system. He contacts the Ground Control Officer, or GC, who coordinates spaceflight tracking and the shuttle's data network.
GC, how far are we from UHF? Is that 2-minute clock good?
Affirmative, flight.
The flight director talks to INCO officer Laura Hopp once again.
INCO, we were rolled left last data we had, and you weren't expecting a little bit of Radicom, but not this long.
That's correct, flight. I expect it to be a little bit intermittent, and this is pretty solid right here.
No onboard system config changes right before we lost data.
That's correct, flight. All look good.
Still all on string 2 and everything looked good.
String 2 looking good.
The mission controllers are referring to the S-band transmission frequency, which was being used to communicate with the shuttle.
2 minutes to Mila.
The ground controller announces that the shuttle is 2 minutes from being in UHF radio range of the Merritt Island Launch Annex, or MILA, a tracking station near Cape Canaveral. As well as being able to communicate with the shuttle, the complex can detect radio frequencies coming from the shuttle and use radar to scan for the orbiter's radar signature. In anticipation of this, Flight Director Kane instructs Capcom to begin trying to make contact with Shuttle Columbia, using any means, including UHF radio. Hoba begins trying to raise the orbiter.
Columbia, Houston, comm check.
There is no response. By 9:03 a.m., communications with Columbia still have not been restored.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
Max Officer Kling speaks to Flight Director Kane over the loop once again.
Flight Max.
Max.
On the tire pressures, we did see them go erratic for a little bit before they went away, so I do believe it's instrumentation.
Okay.
Max Officer Kling does not believe it is the tires which have failed, but rather the sensors reading the data, due to the confused readings they gave out shortly before they stopped providing data. While the situation is deeply alarming, the flight controllers in Houston have no data to suggest that the orbiter is in trouble, so the activities in mission control proceed as planned. As well as dealing with the problem of the loss of communications, the flight director is managing communication from the flight dynamics officer on routine information about weather balloon measurements for wind speed at Kennedy Space Center and the anticipated touchdown point on the runway. The Flight Dynamics Officer, or FIDO as they are referred to, is responsible for managing the shuttle's flight path as well as monitoring tracking data on the position of the orbiter. The flight director instructs Capcom to continue to try and raise Columbia via UHF radio.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
There is still no response. At 9:05 a.m., the ground controller speaks to the flight director once again.
Flight GC.
Go.
Milo's not reporting any RAF at this time.
Had the mission been proceeding as planned, the Merritt Island Launch Annex should have been able to communicate with Columbia by now. The Integrated Communications Officer, Laura Hopp, reaches out to Flight Director Kane.
Flight Info, SBC just should have taken us to staying low.
Okay.
This is more bad news. STDN is the Space Tracking and Data Network, or Ground Station Communications Mode. Based on its proximity to Kennedy Space Center, the orbiter should no longer require the use of satellites to communicate. The system is designed to automatically shift communications to the ground-based system, but no communication from the shuttle has been made. With no radio communications, Kane's final hope is that all communications have failed, but the orbiter is still tracking towards Kennedy Space Center. He contacts his flight dynamics officer.
Fido, when are you expecting tracking?
1 minute ago, flight.
The shuttle simply isn't there.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
1.5 minutes later, the ground controller speaks to the flight director.
Flight GC, no C-band yet.
Copy.
Cape Canaveral is fitted with a C-band radar, which should be able to detect the radar signature of Columbia on approach, but this message indicates that no signal is being received. Something has clearly gone very wrong, but at this point it is impossible to say what. All the mission controllers can do is attempt to regain communications with Columbia.
Columbia, Houston, UHF comm check.
At 9:07, in a last-ditch effort to establish communications with the shuttle, the INCO officer contacts the flight director.
Flight Inco.
Go.
I could swap strings in the blind.
Okay. Command is over.
Good work, Flight.
The INCO officer executes a command sequence to Columbia to force the onboard S-band communication system to the backup string of avionics to try to regain communication. At 9:09 a.m., the ground controller informs Flight Director Kane that the Merritt Island Launch Annex is assigning one of its radar antennas to begin scanning for Columbia.
Flight GC.
Go.
Mila's taking one of their antennas off into a search mode.
Copy. Vital flight.
Go ahead, flight.
Have we gotten any tracking data?
We got a blip of tracking data. It was a bad data point, flight. We do not believe that was the orbiter. We're in a search pattern with our C-bands at this time. We do not have any valid data at this time.
Sitting behind Flight Director Kane is another experienced member of the mission control team, Phil Englauf, who represents senior management at Johnson Space Center. He receives a call from an off-duty flight director, Brian Austin. Austin had stepped out of his home to watch the trails from Columbia as it passed overhead. However, on looking into the clear morning sky, he has seen something quite different. Englauf finishes his call, and after first telling his colleague beside him, calls over Flight Director Kane, who is sitting in the row in front of him. Englauf confirms to Kane what he likely already knows. The Space Shuttle Columbia has broken up over Texas. In the footage taken as the news is broken to the flight director, Kane pauses briefly, then turns back to his console, speaking to the ground controller.
GC flight. GC flight.
Flight GC.
Lock the doors.
Copy.
The doors to the Mission Control Center were locked so that none of the controllers may leave. With communications with Columbia lost, NASA declared a shuttle contingency and executed the Contingency Action Plan, an agreed set of activities that had been established after the loss of the Challenger space shuttle in 1986. Controllers were instructed to complete their data logs and take snapshots of all data on their systems in order to assist with the inevitable investigation. They were limited from contacting anybody via telephone and effectively isolated while their work was carried out. NASA activated its own mishap investigation team, which would take initial charge of the search and rescue operations, as well as recovery of the shuttle. About 15 minutes earlier, in North Texas, a local news outlet was filming the re-entry of the shuttle Columbia live as part of its morning news segment. The cameraman captured Columbia passing overhead at approximately 9 a.m. In the clear blue sky, Columbia appeared as a bright streak of light, passing over with a trail behind it. But as the footage continued, the single bright streak that made up the shuttle began to shed objects, which themselves began to glow.
Right. The bright light you see, obviously some of the some of the heat-resistant material lighting up on the shuttle.
After a few seconds, the main object itself began to split into smaller objects. To those watching on the ground, the streaks of light were followed sometime later with a deep, crackling boom, followed by a long rumble. This was followed a few minutes later by the debris. Items ranging from as small as a petri dish to as large as the shuttle's nose cone began to rain down on the state of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. A woman driving her car in Texas almost lost control when a piece of the shuttle smashed into her windscreen as she was driving. Dispatchers from the emergency services in Texas were inundated with calls regarding the sonic booms of the orbiter and the smoking debris which had begun landing. It did not take them long to realize that the debris they were finding was the remains of the shuttle Columbia that NASA had reported missing a few minutes earlier. Meanwhile, at the shuttle landing facility at Kennedy Space Center, a crowd of spectators and families of the astronauts were gathered and waiting for Columbia to arrive. The shuttle was scheduled to arrive at 8:16 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The large clock, set up to count down to Columbia's scheduled arrival time, counted down to 0, then began counting upwards. The astronauts waiting with the families were aware that something was wrong. There was no telltale sonic boom of the orbiter approaching, and worst of all, the astronauts received news that the powerful radar used to track the shuttle had found no sign of its approach. It was left to the astronauts on the ground to tell the families of the crew of STS-107 what had happened. Local search and rescue resources were activated in the area that the orbiter had been seen to break up. While rescue operations were part of the contingency plan, there was little doubt in anybody's mind that the crew of Columbia have perished. At the time shuttle communications had stopped, the orbiter had been travelling at an altitude of 200,000 feet at a speed of more than 12,000 miles per hour. Although Columbia did have provisions for the crew to bail out, this would have been impossible at the speed and altitude the orbiter was flying at. At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, President George Bush addressed the nation on the status of Columbia.
My fellow Americans, this day has brought terrible news and great sadness to our country. At 9 o'clock this morning, Mission Control in Houston lost contact with our Space Shuttle Columbia. A short time later, debris was seen falling from the skies above Texas. The Columbia is lost. There are no survivors. On board was a crew of 7. Colonel Rick Husband, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, Commander Laurel Clark, Captain David Brown, Commander William McCool, Dr. Kulpna Shavla, and Ilan Ramon, a colonel in the Israeli Air Force. These men and women assumed great risk in the service to all humanity. In an age when spaceflight has come to seem almost routine, it is easy to overlook the dangers of travel by rocket and the difficulties of navigating the fierce outer atmosphere of the Earth. These astronauts knew the dangers, and they faced them willingly, knowing they had a high and noble purpose in life. Because of their courage and daring and idealism, we will miss them all the more.
President Bush declared East Texas, where the majority of debris had fallen, as a federal disaster area, which enabled the deployment of emergency response teams from the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Environmental Protection Agency. Local police and volunteers headed into the dense pine forests in the area in the search for the remains of the astronauts and the debris from the orbiter. Also immediately after the NASA contingency was declared, NASA issued a bulletin asking the public not to touch any of the debris from the orbiter. The reaction control thrusters used substances that were highly toxic to humans. These chemicals included monomethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, as well as concentrated ammonia used in the orbiter's cooling systems. These chemicals can severely burn the lungs and any exposed skin when encountered in vapor form. The orbiter also contained various pyrotechnic devices used to jettison parts of the shuttle in an emergency and were designed to withstand high heat caused by re-entry. The public were instead advised to contact local police departments with any debris reports. Although the investigation was in its infancy, the media had already begun to speculate what led to Columbia's destruction. Later, on the same day of the accident, NASA held a press conference on the loss of Columbia. At the briefing, the hosts expressed their shock at the event, described what they knew so far, then turned the conference over to the media for questions.
Right here next to him.
I'm Brian Sass for KPRC-TV here in Houston. We had heard some reports that during launch there were concerns that some debris hit the wing. Is that true, and is that any cause of concern that could have caused today's problems?
It is true that right after launch, and I don't remember the time frame as far as the seconds, there was a piece of foam that is used as insulation on the external tank in the area of what we call the bipod, which is the forward attach between the orbiter and the external tank. There is a piece of foam that was shed, and in our review the following day of the launch films, we saw this piece of debris drop off, and it looked to us like it impacted the orbiter on the left wing. Where on the left wing, it's very difficult for us to tell. Somewhere between the mid and outward span. Was it the leading edge? We don't know. Was it underneath the leading edge? We really don't know. To the best of our ability, that's what happened. We spent a goodly amount of time reviewing that film and then analyzing what that potential impact of debris on the wing might do, and would there be any consequences. Through analysis and through our ability to call back on our experience with tile, it was judged that that event did not represent a safety concern. And so the technical community got together and across the country looked at it and judged that to be acceptable. And so as we look at that now in hindsight, that impact was on the left wing. And certainly we have all the indications that Milt talked to you about were on the left wing. We can't discount that there might be a connection. But we have to caution you and ourselves that we can't rush to judgment on it, because there are a lot of things in this business that look like the smoking gun but turn out not even to be close. And so we really have to do some regression analysis. We've got to look at what Milt described to you, and then back up in time through analysis to see if we can piece together the events and whether or not this was a tile problem or whether it was a structural issue or some other event. We don't know yet. What will help us determine that is inspecting the debris. That will really help us. And so we're very anxious to get certain pieces back to look at, and that will determine whether or not this particular event, whether it was the debris hitting the orbiter or some other event, was a cause of this problem or this disaster today.
As we have seen in previous episodes, the search for aircraft wreckage can be very challenging, particularly in situations where the aircraft breaks up at cruising altitude. The loss of Columbia amplified this to an unprecedented scale. Reports were becoming available that spectators had actually seen Columbia begin shedding debris over the coast of California. The shuttle had then travelled for another 7 minutes at an altitude of about 200,000 feet and a speed of more than 12,000 miles per hour. The debris field would be enormous. Despite the best efforts of local residents to report shuttle debris, a coordinated large-scale approach would be required in order to locate and retrieve what was left of Columbia and to return the bodies of the astronauts to their families. The final crucial component of NASA's contingency action plan involved the activation of the International Space Station and Space Shuttle Mishap Interagency Investigation Board. This would shortly afterwards be renamed to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. The board's role was to fulfill a similar role to that which the NTSB plays in investigating civil aviation accidents in the United States. Uncover the facts, as well as the actual or probable causes of the space shuttle mishap, and recommend preventative and other appropriate actions to preclude the recurrence of a similar mishap. The board would take some time to convene, so initial efforts were led by NASA's own mishap investigation team. While it would be the Columbia Accident Investigation Board who would head the investigation into the loss of the orbiter, they would ultimately need to rely on NASA for much of the investigation, given the incredibly complex and unique technologies associated with the space shuttle. By the 6th of February, 5 days after the accident, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board had been established and was in a position to take over from the NASA Mishap Investigation Team. To coordinate the search for debris, NASA and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, enlisted the support of the Forest Service's wildland firefighter units, who would act as the primary search teams on the ground. As NASA identified areas of interest to be searched, the Forest Service would supply the personnel and equipment needed to search the area. Within 2 weeks of the accident, the number of ground searchers exceeded 3,000 personnel. Within a month, more than 4,000 searchers were involved. These personnel were drawn from across the United States and Puerto Rico and would work 12 hours per day on rotation. The personnel were accompanied by NASA and EPA personnel with GPS equipment who were trained to identify and handle the debris. NASA used computer modeling in addition to telemetry, radar, photographs, video and reports from the public to estimate the trajectory of the debris and therefore its likely location. Teams were dispatched to walk precise grids. The searchers would work in 20-person teams, walking in lines 10 feet apart. This was not an arbitrary distance, but one which was calculated to provide a 75% probability of detecting a 6-inch square piece of debris. The teams covered an area 2 miles to either side of Columbia's ground track, with initial search efforts focused on the recovery of the remains of the astronauts. The terrain was deeply unforgiving and ranged from dense pine brush to swampland. Once a piece of debris was located, it was photographed on site, and its position was accurately plotted using GPS equipment before being bagged and taken to a central location. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was the government agency tasked with the management of the recovery of the crew remains. The remains were taken to the Air Force Institute of Pathology for identification. While the recovery of the remains of the astronauts was important for their families, it would also provide valuable evidence in determining the chain of events which led to the shuttle's destruction. Autopsies were therefore carried out on all of the identified remains. The remains of all 7 of the astronauts of STS-107 would eventually be found. As well as the search for crew remains, priority was placed on 20 hot items which would potentially contain crucial information in determining what had caused Columbia to break up. This included the orbiter's general-purpose computers, film, cameras, and the modular auxiliary data system recorder. With the aid of the wildland firefighters, recovery rates for debris eventually exceeded 1,000 items per day. In the air, crews used a fleet of 37 helicopters and 7 fixed-wing aircraft to support the searchers on the ground. They searched farther out from the shuttle's ground track. While the aircraft initially used sophisticated scanning radar and infrared, the size of the debris made these technologies useless. The majority of the work would be done by spotter teams who would simply visually scan the terrain from the air. Unfortunately, during the air search, a Bell 407 helicopter crashed in the Angelina National Park after a mechanical failure. This killed 2 and injured 3 others. Given the debris of the shuttle was government property, as well as essential evidence in the investigation, NASA and local media outlets urged local residents to report any debris immediately and not to keep it. NASA offered an amnesty for people who may have held on to pieces of Columbia as grim souvenirs. All of the debris was transported to the Kennedy Space Center, where it was arrayed on a full-scale representation of the shuttle. Here, the meticulous recording of the shuttle debris proved extremely helpful to investigators. Not only would the condition of the debris help investigators piece together what had happened, where it had been situated on the orbiter and where it had been found on the ground were also crucial. This was because the trail of debris provided a representation of what had begun to fail and be shed from the orbiter first, and therefore the likely location of the initial problem with the orbiter. In total, over 700,000 acres were searched by foot, with the searchers locating a total of more than 84,000 pieces of debris, weighing 85,000 pounds. This represented 38% of the orbiter's total dry weight, an incredible achievement given the speed and violence of the shuttle's breakup. In order to ensure that attention was given to all components of the orbiter, under supervision from the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, the NASA Accident Investigation Team used fault tree analysis to consider what had led to the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia. This method is a common tool used in systems engineering. Fault trees are graphical representations of each conceivable sequence of events that would cause a system to fail. The fault tree's uppermost level illustrates the events that could have directly caused the loss of Columbia by aerodynamic breakup during reentry. Subsequent levels comprise all individual elements or factors that could cause the failure described immediately above it, and so on. In this way, all potential chains of causation that could lead ultimately to the loss of Columbia can be diagrammed, and the behavior of every subsystem that was a cause can be eliminated from consideration. NASA chartered 6 teams to develop fault trees, 1 for each of the shuttle's major components: the orbiter, Space Shuttle main engines, reusable solid rocket motors, external tanks, and the payload. A 7th systems integration fault tree analyzed failure scenarios involving 2 or more of the shuttle components. Some of the fault trees were very large and intricate. For instance, the orbiter fault tree, which only considers events on the orbiter that could lead to the accident, included 234 elements. The systems integration tree, which deals with the interactions among parts of the shuttle, included 295 multi-element integration faults, 128 orbiter multi-element faults, and 221 connections to the other shuttle components. Where investigators ruled out a potential cascade of events, as represented by a branch on the fault tree, it was deemed closed. When evidence proved inconclusive, the item remained open. Some elements could be dismissed at a high level in the tree, but most required delving into lower levels. An intact shuttle component, or system, for example a piece of the orbiter debris, often provided the basis for closing an element. Telemetry data from the orbiter was also equally useful. It frequently demonstrated that a system operated correctly until the loss of signal, providing strong evidence that the system in question did not contribute to the accident. In the case of the loss of Columbia, there could be two plausible explanations for the aerodynamic breakup of the orbiter. 1. The orbiter sustained structural damage that undermined attitude control during re-entry, or 2. The orbiter maneuvered to an attitude that it was not designed to fly. Telemetry and other data strongly suggested to investigators that improper maneuvering was not a factor in the breakup of Columbia. Therefore, most of the fault tree analysis concentrated on structural damage that could have impeded the orbiter's attitude control in spite of properly operating guidance, navigation, and flight control systems. There was one potential source of damage to Columbia which was obvious to everybody, from those working at NASA to the general public, who had been made aware from leaked reports to the media: the foam strike on Columbia's wing on the day of the launch. Investigators were initially keen to understand how foam could have dislodged itself from the external tank in the first place, but to do this, we need to understand a little about the external tank itself. The three RS-25 main engines of the Space Shuttle, located on its tail, burn propellant at a rate which would drain an average swimming pool in 20 seconds. There is no way that this volume of propellant can be kept within the orbiter itself, so instead it is held in the external tank. The external tank contains the two main components required to power the Space Shuttle: 1.5 million litres of liquid hydrogen, the fuel of the engines, and more than 500,000 litres of liquid oxygen, the oxidizer required to maintain ignition of the rockets, even once it leaves the Earth's atmosphere. These propellants are stored at a temperature of -252 degrees and -180 degrees Celsius respectively. If the surface of the tank was to be exposed to the warm air that surrounded it, the liquids would quickly boil off and fuel would be lost. In addition, ice would form on the outside of the tank, as water vapour froze on it, forming thick layers of ice. Upon launch, this ice could potentially break off and damage the orbiter. To stop both of these events from happening, large areas of the external tank are sprayed with 1 to 2 inches of insulating foam. Fixtures such as the bipod ramp, which the shuttle attaches to the external tank with, are hand-sculpted with thicker coats of foam. This insulation is so effective that the surface of the external tank with the foam applied is only slightly cool to the touch. While the solution is effective, there is a problem. During flight, pieces of foam ranging from the size of popcorn to the size of a briefcase had been witnessed to fall from the external tank. This shedding of foam had a long and well-documented history. In fact, most space shuttle missions have had insulating foam shed during the ascent. It was believed that the problem was well understood and was most likely caused by a temperature phenomenon known as cryopumping or cryoingestion. In both of these cases, there would be a liquid trapped within the foam which covered the tank. During the launch, as the external tank heated up due to the atmospheric effects and the use of the fuel contained within it, this liquid would increase in temperature, causing the pressure within the area to also rise. It was believed that this pressure would cause the foam to dislodge. This was theorized as the cause of foam being separated from the shuttle during launch. Unfortunately, the external tank was considered a disposable component of the Space Shuttle system, breaking up over the Indian Ocean due to aerodynamic forces once it was detached from the orbiter. As a consequence, the external tank could not be recovered to confirm this theory. While this shedding of foam was the most obvious sign of damage that investigators could find, they still needed to prove that it was the foam which caused Columbia to disintegrate. Investigators would embark upon 4 paths of analysis to try and determine if it was indeed the foam strike which had caused Columbia to break apart on the 1st of February 2003. Part 1. Image and Transport Analysis. At 81.9 seconds after the launch of Columbia, unnoticed at the time of the launch, a sizable piece of foam detached from the left bipod of the external tank. A 35mm film camera recorded the foam strike from 17 miles away, and a video camera recording from 26 miles away provided the best of the available evidence. Analysis of this visual evidence refined the potential impact area to one less than 20 square feet. The impact point was believed to be the reinforced carbon-carbon panels 6 through 9 on the orbiter's left wing leading edge. The piece of foam was between 21 and 27 inches long and about 12 inches wide. This image analysis revealed that the foam was moving almost parallel to the orbiter when it struck the bottom of the wing. It therefore hit the wing almost head-on and appeared to disintegrate after striking the orbiter. To further the board's investigation, computer-aided transport analysis was also undertaken. Transport analysis is simply the process of determining the path of the piece of foam. A variety of computer models were used to estimate the volume of the foam, as well as to refine the estimates of its speed, its dimensions, and the location of impact. Despite the uncertainties caused by the irregular shape of the foam, the simulation team were able to identify a narrow range of foam impact velocities and the ballistic coefficients of the foam. These would be useful in actual physical simulations used later. Just prior to separation, the speed of the foam was equal to the speed of the shuttle, about 1,568 miles per hour. But when the foam detached, because of the large drag force, the foam was slowed to about 1,022 miles per hour in about 0.2 seconds. This meant that Columbia had effectively run into the piece of foam at 500 miles per hour. The investigators looked for more information to deepen their understanding of the debris impact. Immediately after the accident, the United States Air Force Space Command began a detailed review of its space surveillance network data to determine if there was any detectable anomalies during the STS-107 mission. Unfortunately, a review of the data resulted in no information regarding damage to the orbiter during launch. However, the Air Force did have a large quantity of observations of the shuttle once it was on orbit. Their observations showed a small object in orbit with Columbia. In accordance with what is known as the International Designator System, which assigns an ID to human-created objects in Earth orbit, the object was named 2003-003b. Columbia herself was 2003-003a. The small object appeared on January 17th, the day after Columbia had been launched. Since the object appeared to have separated while the shuttle had been undertaking maneuvers, the nature of those maneuvers was of great interest to investigators. On review, the orbiter had undertaken 2 maneuvers. Before the shuttle began maneuvering, it was travelling with its tail in the direction of travel. First, the orbiter had yawed round, so its left wing was facing in the direction of travel. Then, the orbiter had also oriented itself upside down relative to the surface of the Earth, with its payload bay pointing downwards. The orbiter remained in this attitude for about half an hour before returning to its original position. It was considered likely that these maneuvers had dislodged the object from Columbia somehow. The object was tracked over the next 3.5 days, until its orbit decayed and it burned up in the Earth's atmosphere. While investigators did not have an image of what the object was, they did have some information to go on. In particular, they knew the object's ballistic coefficient and its radar cross-section. With this information available, investigators looked at a selection of 31 materials from the orbiter's exterior which might have come loose. The radar data was used to discount the objects which did not match with it. Only one potential object matched the radar cross-section and ballistic coefficients observed by the Space Surveillance Network. A fragment of the reinforced carbon-carbon panels on the orbiter's leading-edge wing. Such a panel would need to be about 140 square inches in area to meet the observed radar cross-section. This evidence strongly pointed to the foam strike having managed to damage one of the RCC panels to such an extent that a piece of it had been knocked from the orbiter. The finding was ominous. The reinforced carbon-carbon panels form part of the orbiter's thermal protection system. It is the shuttle's only defense against the heat of re-entry. Any gap in the thermal protection system, no matter how small, allows the hot gases surrounding the shuttle to enter it in a phenomenon known as a burn-through. If such a situation were to occur, the heat would wreak havoc on the fragile internal structure of the orbiter, which was never designed to withstand these temperatures. But while the analysis suggested that it was a reinforced carbon-carbon panel which had come loose from the orbiter, there was no definitive proof. Further avenues of investigation would need to be pursued. Part 2. Debris Analysis. The transport and image analysis had revealed that potential damage to Columbia's left wing had occurred in the areas of reinforced carbon-carbon panels 6 through 9. It would be debris analysis which would prove that the damage had occurred and narrow the location to a single panel. Investigators undertook an exhaustive examination of the debris of the shuttle, which was recovered. One of the major challenges which investigators had was determining what damage had been caused to the shuttle prior to the breakup of the vehicle versus what had happened afterwards. As Columbia was breaking up, she was still travelling at thousands of miles per hour, so all recovered components were subjected to the intense heat of re-entry. There was no easy way to tell what damage had been caused prior to the breakup, so investigators had to look at each piece of debris on a case-by-case basis. First, investigators compared the quantity of debris recovered for the left wing versus the right wing. While a substantial quantity of upper and lower right wing structure was recovered, very little of the left wing structure had been found. In addition, it appeared that pieces of the left wing had been exposed to higher levels of heat damage than the right. Very little of the internal structure of the left wing was found either. The difference in heat damage told the investigators that while the right wing had failed due to aerodynamic forces only, the left wing had sustained significant heat damage before suffering complete aerodynamic failure. In other words, the left wing had failed first. The thermal protection system tiles that were recovered for the lower left wing told their own story. While tiles on the right wing appeared to have simply broken off due to aerodynamic forces, the tiles on the left wing near reinforced carbon-carbon panels 8 and 9 showed damage on the opposite side of what would be expected. The adhesive that had held the tiles to the orbiter's structure had melted, causing the tiles to come loose. This suggested that the damage which these tiles experienced came from the inside of the wing. As the aluminium skin of the shuttle was heated, the strength of the tile bond degraded, and eventually the tile separated from the orbiter. Investigators turned their attention to the leading-edge reinforced carbon-carbon panels, part of which the investigators believed had come loose in orbit. As we discussed earlier, the location of the debris of the orbiter had been meticulously plotted. The coordinates of every piece of recovered RCC panel were plotted on a map and labelled according to the panel the piece originally came from. Two distinct patterns became evident. The first was that pieces from left wing RCC panel 9 through 22 had fallen farthest west, and RCC panels 1 through 7 had fallen further east. This told investigators that panels 1 through 7 had stayed with the shuttle longest, and had therefore suffered the least damage before Columbia had broken up. The second point investigators noticed was that while the debris of most RCC panels was fairly localized, the remains of one panel was spread throughout the debris field. RCC panel 8 left. This suggested that this panel had deteriorated steadily as Columbia continued on her journey, rather than being torn from the orbiter due to aerodynamic forces. It provided a very strong indication that damage had originated in this area. This panel location was directly in the center of what the earlier transport analysis had predicted. To further their understanding of the damage Columbia had suffered, investigators also undertook chemical analysis of the thermal protection system tiles which had been recovered from the left wing. On the left wing tiles, they found deposits of molten metal, which had subsequently solidified. Most tellingly, the most significant deposits were located on RCC panels 8 and 9. The deposits were later determined by chemical analysis to be an alloy called Inconel 718. Inconel 718 was an alloy used on the fittings for the wing leading edge, which held the RCC panels in place. Subsequent X-ray analysis showed that the molten deposits had a bottom-to-top pattern, which was consistent with superheated airflow entering the RCC panel and melting the Inconel 718, which had then been sprayed backwards, mostly onto the tiles behind RCC panels 8 and 9. This evidence was considered conclusive by the Columbia Accident Investigation Board in determining where the damage to the left wing had been located. Panel 8 left. Part 3. Impact Analysis. Although a foam strike had been observed, and the damage to Columbia appeared to point to a burn-through of the orbiter's left wing, there was still doubt that the foam impact would be severe enough to damage the reinforced carbon-carbon panel. It was therefore important to prove that a foam strike could indeed cause the sort of damage which could lead to a breach in the shuttle's thermal protection system. The reinforced carbon-carbon panels on the Space Shuttle Orbiter's wing leading edges most closely resemble highly complex fiberglass. They are layers of graphite cloth which are then molded to the desired shape at very high temperatures. There are 22 of these panels on each of the orbiter's wings, with the panels being numbered outward. Each panel is unique given the curvature of the orbiter's wing. While the RCC panels are very effective in absorbing heat and not permitting it to travel through to the orbiter's aluminium structure, they are very vulnerable to impact. A close approximation would be styrofoam, a good insulator, but something which can be easily damaged by even our fingernails. The same is true for the RCT panels. To understand what sort of effect the piece of bipod ramp foam would have had on one of the RCC panels, the investigators would undertake a real-life experiment. The concept was to strike flight-worthy leading-edge RCC panel assemblies with foam projectiles. These would be fired by a compressed gas cannon at the same speed as a piece of debris might have struck Columbia. The gas cannon had originally been designed to model the impact of bird strikes on an aircraft's fuselage, but was modified by adding a 35-foot-long barrel shaped like a rectangle. RCC panels with a flight history that was similar to Columbia would be mounted on a support that was structurally equivalent to Columbia's wing. 200 sensors, including cameras, strain gauges, and accelerometers, were then attached to the test stand, trained on the RCC panel. Test projectiles were made from the same type of foam as the bipod ramp on STS-107's external tank assembly. The object's mass and velocity were estimated using the earlier simulations which had been completed, in addition to studying the imagery of the debris strike. The investigators studied impacts on a number of panels. This was done to refine the testing equipment, given the limited number of flight-worthy panels that investigators had to test with. But the real panel of interest, based on the transport analysis and debris analysis, was RCC Panel 8 Left. The panel used as a stand-in for Columbia's RCC Panel 8 Left had been taken from Atlantis, which had flown 26 missions, a close approximation to Columbia's 28 missions, including STS-107. The parameters chosen for the test were a 1.67-pound projectile, striking Panel 8 at 777 feet per second at an angle of 21.5 degrees.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The results of the test were unequivocal. The impact of the foam with the wing punched a hole in the RCC panel. This hole measured 16 inches by 17 inches, which was within the range consistent with all findings of the investigation so far. In addition to the impact, 3 large pieces of the broken panel face were retained within the wing itself. The 2 largest pieces had surface areas of 86 and 75 square inches respectively. While we will never know with certainty, these pieces could well have been similar to the debris which had fallen from the Columbia while she was in orbit. These could have stayed in the wing cavity after impact, only to be dislodged during Columbia's maneuvers. The test had clearly demonstrated that the foam impact of the severity which Columbia had experienced could seriously breach the leading-edge reinforced carbon-carbon panel of the orbiter. The investigators knew what had caused the initial damage to the wing, and the shuttle breakup demonstrated the outcome. Now, the investigators would need to look at the events which would cause Columbia to disintegrate. Part 4. Deorbit and reentry analysis. As with most factors of spaceflight, the deorbit of the Space Shuttle Orbiter is a complex operation. When the Space Shuttle is orbiting, it is essentially in a balance of constantly falling back towards the Earth, but travelling so quickly that it never actually strikes the Earth's surface. When the shuttle wishes to deorbit, it slows its speed down to a point where it will strike the Earth, or more correctly, the Earth's atmosphere. In order to decelerate from an orbital speed of 15,000 miles per hour to a standstill at Kennedy Space Center, the shuttle must dissipate a great deal of energy. It does this first by performing a deorbit burn. This bleeds off only a tiny percentage of its speed, about 1%, and since the orbiter is no longer flying fast enough to avoid the Earth's surface, it begins falling back to Earth. If the Earth had no atmosphere, the orbiter would eventually land, still travelling at slightly less than 15,000 miles per hour. But because of Earth's atmosphere, the rest of the shuttle's energy can be lost by exposing as much of the lower surface of the shuttle to Earth's atmosphere as possible in order to generate drag. The friction of the air molecules causes the shuttle to decelerate, but this process generates very high temperatures. While it is friction against the air molecules which causes the shuttle to decelerate, it is not friction which causes the heating. Instead, the heat is caused by air molecules not being able to be pushed out of the way of the orbiter fast enough. This causes the air molecules to be compressed, creating a shock wave in front of the orbiter as it enters the atmosphere. The pressure causes the temperature of the air molecules to increase in a process known as adiabatic heating. We experience this heating in our everyday lives when we use a hand pump to inflate a bicycle tire or a ball. The heat felt on the pump is the exact same phenomenon as air is compressed with nowhere to go. However, in the case of the space shuttle, the heating experienced is somewhat more extreme. In order to protect its aluminium airframe, which would melt at much lower temperatures, the space shuttle is fitted with a thermal protection system. As STS-107 deorbited and Columbia re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, the orbiter relayed streams of data to both the entry controllers on the ground and to the Modular Auxiliary Data System Recorder, which acts as a sort of digital flight data recorder, capturing critical information about the orbiter. The recorder had somehow survived the breakup of Columbia and was recovered by ground search teams. By comparing the data contained within the recorder and the data received on the ground with information from shuttle missions which had successfully landed, the investigators could build a clearer picture of what had gone wrong and when it had happened. While those sitting on the ground first noticed a problem at about 8:54 a.m., the first signs of a problem recorded by the shuttle itself actually occurred nearly 6 minutes earlier, at 8:48 a.m. At this time, the Modular Auxiliary Data System recorded the first unusual condition while still above the Pacific Ocean. 4 sensors, mounted on the left wing, tells the story of what happened in incredible detail. These sensors were mounted on one of the left wing's spars, the internal structure of the wing, which gives it its strength. The sensors were located behind reinforced carbon-carbon panel 9 left, directly beside where investigators believed the breach to the wing had occurred. The sensors were all located within about 2 feet of each other. The first unusual reading came from a strain gauge attached to the wing spar directly behind RCC panel 9. The strain gauge is designed to change its resistance as the object it is attached to deforms. 4.5 minutes after entry interface, the strain gauge began recording a higher than usual level of strain on the left spar. This strain continued for a period of 90 seconds before dropping again. Suddenly, the level of strain completely reversed and continued this way for 25 seconds before the reading for the sensor became unreliable. This strain indicated that the aluminium spar was being subjected to such high temperatures that it was causing it to melt and warp until the wiring to the sensor failed. The second sensor reading of interest came from a thermocouple designed to measure temperatures on a clevis pin attaching RCC panels 9 and 10 to each other. 20 seconds after the strain gauge had begun showing its first strange reading, the thermocouple also began indicating abnormal readings. The temperature in this area during re-entry was expected to be about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, or -1 degree Celsius. Over a period of 3.5 minutes, the temperature recorded by the sensor increased to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, or 18 degrees Celsius, before displaying a reading of off-scale low. The failure of the sensor was very sudden, and indicated only a slightly abnormal warming of this area before failing. Although abnormal, this re-entry temperature rise was slow and small compared to what would be expected if Sensor 2 was exposed to a blast of superheated air from an assumed breach in the RCC panel. Investigators believed from their transport analysis that it had been RCC panel 8 which had been breached, which was some distance away from the clevis pin thermocouple of RCC panel 9 and 10. In addition, the thermocouple was well insulated. Investigators used a variety of hole sizes in panel 8 to simulate what most closely represented what had happened during Columbia's final flight. The hole size which most closely reflected the heating that the thermocouple sensor detected was 10 inches in diameter in RCC panel 8. The third sensor of importance was another temperature sensor, this time located in a thermal tile on the bottom of the wing beside RCC panel 9. While the first two sensors had been designed to measure conditions inside the wing, the third sensor was designed to measure the temperature on the outside of the shuttle. This sensor began showing abnormal readings at 8:50 a.m., with several brief spikes up to 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit or 1,350 degrees Celsius. This was significantly higher than the 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit or 1,100 degrees Celsius which would be expected in a normal re-entry profile. Investigators put this reading down to the jet of hot air passing through the hole in RCC panel 8 left, or the airflow on the exterior of the shuttle being disturbed due to the abnormally shaped wing. About 8 minutes after re-entry, the readings on sensor 3 also became unreliable, most likely caused by the cabling it was attached to being burnt through or a failure of the sensor itself. The final sensor was a thermometer mounted on the wing leading edge spar between RCC panels 8 and 9. Sensor 4 also recorded an increase in temperature before failure, but unlike Sensor 2, which had only shown a small increase in temperature, Sensor 4's reading increased dramatically. Beginning at 8:51 a.m., the temperature rose from an expected 20 degrees Fahrenheit to 50 degrees Fahrenheit a minute later. Then the temperature began to rise more quickly to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, then off-scale high, indicating the temperatures it was recording was beyond the capabilities of the sensor. The investigators could use the location of the sensors and the cables which they were attached to in order to work out how the destruction of the aircraft's wing had unfolded. They had detailed close-out images of the wings, which showed exactly where these cables had been arrayed in Columbia during the final flight. The wiring for the sensors of interest, as well as many others, were taped to the leading edge spar, which ran along until the opening in the shuttle's fuselage. 3 of the sensors had failed within 10 seconds of each other, while sensor 4 had continued operating another 25 seconds longer. When the investigators looked at the bundles of wiring, it told them that after penetrating the RCC panel, the jet of superheated air burnt through the leading edge spar. First, it had pierced through the top of the spar, where the wirings for sensor 1, 2, and 3 ran. It had then gradually extended downwards, destroying the wiring for sensor 4. The aerodynamic roll and yaw forces experienced by Columbia began to differ to those on previous flights at 8:52 and 30 seconds, about 8.5 minutes after the shuttle had begun encountering the Earth's atmosphere. In the early phases of re-entry, these abnormal aerodynamic forces were as a result of Columbia's flight control systems reacting to the abnormal wing shape caused by the damage to RCC panel 8 left. This damage would have made the wing less efficient, causing it to generate less lift and more drag. At 8:53 a.m., Columbia crossed the coast of California. Witnesses on the ground saw Columbia shedding debris as it travelled, which was caught on video camera. Over the following 15 seconds, temperatures on one of Columbia's orbital maneuvering system pods on the left fuselage sidewall began to increase. Wind tunnel tests on a wing missing RCC Panel 8 showed that without this panel in place, the temperature of this area of the shuttle would increase, as well as subjecting the shuttle to abnormal aerodynamic forces. Analysts estimated that by this time in the reentry, superheated air had now been entering Columbia's wing for nearly 70 seconds, and significant internal damage had likely occurred. The aluminium spars and trusses of the shuttle's wing have a melting point of only 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, much lower than the temperature Columbia was being subjected to at this moment. At 8:54 a.m., temperatures within Columbia's left wheel well began to rise rapidly. This told investigators that by this point, the superheated air travelling through the wing's leading edge spar had reached the wheel well. At about the same time, the previous tendency of Columbia to roll to the left as a consequence of her left wing generating less lift reversed. The left wing actually began generating more lift than the right, and the shuttle began trying to bank right. Investigators believed that this was likely due to the wing beginning to deform as the aluminium structure within it stopped providing support. The drag being caused by the left wing was not reduced, and the shuttle continued to yaw to the left, which the shuttle's automatic systems attempted to correct. At 8:56 a.m., a rise in hydraulic line temperatures located inside the left wheel well told investigators that the superheated air coming into the wing had penetrated the wheel well. This temperature rise was noted by Max Officer Jeff Kling in Mission Control. By 8:57 a.m., Columbia had successfully completed its roll reversal, which we discussed earlier, to control its rate of descent. Columbia was now flying with her left wing down. At the same time, the pressure sensors on two of the left main landing gear began to trend upwards before going off-scale low very shortly afterwards. The large mass of the tires would have required significant heating for even this small increase in tire pressure. At 8:58 a.m., the rolling tendency of Columbia changed significantly, which her automatic systems attempted to compensate for. This showed the wing had been deformed still further. By 8:59 a.m., all left main gear inboard and outboard tire pressure and wheel temperature measurements had been lost, indicating burnt wires and a rapid progression of damage to the wheel well. The left main landing gear downlock reported that the landing gear was now extended, but at the same time, a sensor indicated that the landing gear door was still closed, while yet another indicator showed that the main landing gear was locked in the up position. At 8:59 and 30 seconds, sensors showed abrupt changes in Columbia's aerodynamic performance caused by the continual degradation of the left wing structure. Lift on the left wing once again increased, as well as associated drag. Columbia's flight control system attempted to compensate by firing its yaw jets and adjusting the orbiter's flight control surfaces. At this point, hydraulic pressure was lost to the control surfaces. Control of the Space Shuttle Columbia was lost at almost exactly 9 a.m. This sequence of events for the loss of Columbia was compelling and fully explained the data the investigators had located. But as with many accidents, the technical sequence of events for the destruction of the orbiter tells only half the story. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board devoted just as much time to the NASA organization itself, uncovering flaws which had been present within it since its creation during the clandestine age of the Cold War. We will talk about the origins of the Space Shuttle, the pressures which NASA found themselves under during its development, and the flawed decision-making that would lead to the launch of STS-107 and its ultimate destruction. Thank you for listening to part 1 of this episode of Inside the Black Box. The next episode will be released very shortly. Please follow the podcast on Twitter at ITBB Podcast. That's India, Tango, Bravo, Bravo, Podcast. There is a huge amount of data which I would like to share with you that will add a great deal of colour to the story.